What happens in awakening? Buddhism explained lotus light teachings. Strange, isn't it? The tighter we hold on, the more we lose. But if we let go, do we lose everything? Or do we finally gain something real? Have you ever wondered, if we stopped chasing what is constantly slipping away, could we touch something that never fades? Today, we explore a profound truth from the Buddha's teachings. Awakening. Not as an abstract idea, but as a real shift, one that can happen in a single moment of mindfulness. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why a wandering monk smiled as he lost everything, because what remained was true freedom. If you're looking for a path that feels lighter, more open, let's walk this journey together. Subscribe now, because this video may plant a precious seed within you. Chapter 1. When the palace walls no longer protect you. I used to believe that if I could just accomplish enough, achieve more, be more, then life would finally feel complete. That once I arrived at some version of there, the restlessness would quiet down. Like many of us, I thought peace was something I had to earn, not something I already carried within. But life has a way of showing us the truth, gently at first and then all at once. Over 2,500 years ago, in a quiet corner of the Himalayan foothills, a young prince named Siddhartha was living the very dream so many of us chase. Wealth beyond measure, servants, gardens that bloomed out of season, music, comfort, status. His palace was not just a place. It was a world carefully built to shield him from suffering. And for a while it worked. But even the softest silk curtains can't block out the ache of truth forever. One day, Siddhartha left the palace walls and encountered something that would change everything. He saw, perhaps for the very first time, what the world truly held. A sick man, an old man, a corpse, and then a wandering ascetic, someone who had turned away from worldly pleasures in search of deeper meaning. Something stirred in him, not just sadness or fear, but a kind of clarity, a quiet knowing that the comfort he lived in was not freedom, that joy built on things that change will always slip through your fingers like water. Imagine that, realizing that the life everyone tells you to chase is built on foundations that are constantly shifting. He returned to the palace, but nothing felt the same. The laughter, the perfume of the gardens, the weight of his princely robes. It was all still there, but the illusion had cracked. Eventually, he made a choice that many would call unthinkable. He walked away, not because he was heartless, but because he had seen too clearly to pretend anymore. Because something in him whispered that there had to be another way. A way not to escape life, but to understand it. He left not just the palace, but everything. His title, his comfort, even his newborn son. He stepped into the forest with nothing but a robe and a bowl, and a burning question. Why do we suffer? Now pause here with me just for a moment. Have you ever had that kind of moment? Not as dramatic, maybe, but one where the life you were building suddenly felt off. Where you started to wonder, is this all there is? Maybe it happened after achieving something you worked so hard for, only to feel strangely empty. Or maybe it came in the quiet hours, when no one was around to impress, and the question started to whisper. Is there more? What am I chasing, really? That moment, raw, tender, confusing, is the beginning of every honest spiritual journey. Siddhartha wandered through forests and villages, learning from teachers, practicing deep meditation, pushing his body to extremes. He starved. He sat for days. He studied the deepest philosophies of his time. But nothing brought lasting peace. Nothing answered the ache in his heart. Until one night, under the branches of a Bodhi tree, alone, exhausted, and determined, he sat in silence, vowing not to rise until he found the truth. The stars turned overhead. The night deepened, and something began to shift. He turned his attention inward, not to ideas, but to direct experience, to the nature of his thoughts, his sensations, his cravings. And slowly he began to see that everything arising in the mind and body is impermanent, that clinging to what changes brings suffering, and that there is no unchanging self at the center of it all, just a flowing process, like a flame dancing in the wind. This wasn't an idea. It wasn't philosophy. It was something deeper, clear as moonlight on still water, a kind of knowing that settles not just in your head, but in your bones. And then, as dawn broke, so did the illusion. Siddhartha had become the Buddha, the awakened one. But awakening, as we'll see, is not an escape. It's not a blissful detachment or floating away from life. It's stepping fully into reality with eyes wide open, with a heart that sees clearly and no longer clings. He didn't gain something new that night. He let go of what was never real to begin with. And maybe that's the most powerful part of his story. That what he discovered under that tree is something we can discover too. Not in some far-off forest, but in the middle of our very lives. So, if there's a crack forming in your own palace walls, if you're feeling that quiet pull towards something more honest, more real, know this: you're not broken, you're beginning to see, and that is where awakening starts. Chapter 2. Like water that cannot be held. There was a time in my life when I was convinced I had finally figured myself out. You know the feeling, right? After reading a dozen books on personality types, doing a few late-night journaling sessions, and asking myself the big questions, I felt, well, not enlightened, but pretty certain that I knew who I was. I had a story, a tidy little narrative. This is what I like. This is what I fear. This is what makes me who I am. And then, just like that, life happened. The kind of life that doesn't knock politely but barges in, uninvited. A relationship ended. A dream job didn't pan out. I reacted in ways that surprised even me. Anger, silence, clinging, withdrawal. And suddenly, that confident little self I thought I knew, cracked. That's when I stumbled, clumsily but sincerely, into one of the Buddha's most profound teachings, the 5 aggregates, or as they're called in Pali, the 5 khandhas. I remember first reading about them in a dusty corner of a small bookshop. The language was unfamiliar, almost clinical. Form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. They didn't sound spiritual or poetic. They sounded like the parts of a user manual for the human experience. But the more I sat with them, the more alive they became. Imagine sitting by a slow, gentle river. The surface shimmers in the morning light. A leaf drifts by. A ripple forms where a fish moves below. Everything is flowing softly, naturally. Now imagine trying to reach down, cup your hands, and hold that flow in place. You can't. You only hold water for a moment before it slips through your fingers. That's what the Buddha was pointing to. We often treat ourself like a solid object, something we can hold, define, protect. But in reality, what we call me is more like that river, always moving, always changing. Let me share these 5 aggregates with you, not as concepts, but as reflections from everyday life. As I've come to know them, they're not boxes to memorize, but mirrors we can gently hold up to ourselves. The first is form, rupa, our body and the physical world we engage with. I used to believe my body was something I could control, sculpt, manage into perfection. But then came illness, fatigue, aging, aches in places that didn't ache before. And slowly, I began to understand. Even the body is not mine in the way I thought. It shifts, it changes, it breaks and heals without asking for permission. It is nature, not an identity. Then there's feeling Vedana. Those passing sensations that whisper in every moment. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Like that first sip of tea on a cold morning, pleasant. Or the sting of someone's criticism, unpleasant. But have you noticed how quickly they change? That warmth from the tea fades. That sting dulls into a memory. Feelings come and go like clouds across the sky. And yet, how often do we chase them or run from them as if they'll stay forever? Perception, sana, is next, the way we label and interpret what we see. A stranger walks by, and instantly we judge. Friendly, rude, attractive, odd. We name and categorize everything. But our labels are slippery. One day we call the rain gloomy, the next day romantic. It's not the rain that changed, but the lens through which we view it. That's perception at work. Then comes mental formations, sankhara, the thoughts, habits, and tendencies shaped by our past. This is the trickiest one for me. I used to think my thoughts were me. That voice in my head narrating my day, Surely that must be the real me, right? But then I started watching it during meditation. And wow, it was chaos in there. Planning lunch, replaying old conversations, judging, dreaming, worrying, and sometimes all at once. The mind moves like wind through the trees, restless and reactive. But the more I watched, the more I realized, I am not the storm. I am the sky that notices. And finally, consciousness Vijnana. The awareness that knows all these things. The part of us that sees, hears, feels, thinks. But even this is not fixed. Consciousness shifts depending on what it meets. When we're angry, it narrows like a tunnel. When we're calm, it opens wide. It's not a single, unchanging observer. It's a process, always shaped by conditions. So what does all this mean? It means that the self we cling to, the one we get so tangled up in, is not a solid statue, but a dance of processes. A swirl of sensations, ideas, and reactions. When the Buddha realized this, he didn't just understand it intellectually. He saw it directly. He saw that suffering comes when we try to freeze the river. When we grab at feelings, identify with thoughts, take the body or mind as me or mine. But when we see these aggregates for what they are, moving, changing, not self, we begin to loosen our grip. And in that loosening, there is relief. I once shared this teaching with a friend who was going through a painful breakup. She said, "But it hurts so much. I feel like I'm losing part of myself." And I gently asked her, "Which part? The role? The memories? The hopes?" And as she sat quietly, tears in her eyes, she whispered, "All of it, I guess." And then I asked, "What if none of that was ever fixed? What if it was all part of the river?" She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed. And in that small shift, I saw the beginning of healing. You see, this teaching isn't about becoming emotionless or detached. It's about understanding the nature of things so deeply that we stop suffering from trying to make them something they're not. And this isn't just philosophy. Psychology echoes it too. Our identities are constructed from memory, belief, and conditioning. The idea of a fixed self is more a narrative than a reality. Neuroscience shows us how even our preferences and reactions change over time. The Buddha simply saw this long before we had the words or machines to measure it. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by emotion, by identity, by the chaos of being human, try this. Pause. Notice what's happening. A feeling? A thought? A label? Then gently whisper to yourself, this too is part of the river. Let it flow. Watch it pass. You don't have to hold it. You are not the river. You are the spaciousness in which the river moves. And perhaps that's what awakening truly is. Not becoming something new, but remembering what we've always been beneath the noise. Vast, open, aware. Like the quiet stillness beneath a blooming lotus at dawn. And just like that, something softens. Something opens. The self you thought was carved in stone reveals itself to be mist, morning light, the sound of wind passing through a garden. And in that seeing, there is peace. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 3, and we'll keep walking this quiet, beautiful path together. Chapter 3, The 3 Characteristics of Existence. I used to think that if I could just organize my life the right way, if I made the right choices, loved the right people, controlled my time wisely, then everything would finally settle into place. You know, that quiet image in our minds, the perfect day, the steady routine, the sense that everything is just as it should be. But it never really stayed, did it? The moment I'd feel like I had things figured out, bam, something shifted. A relationship changed. A job became uncertain. A moment of peace was interrupted by an unexpected phone call or a surge of anxiety out of nowhere. It was like building a sandcastle too close to the tide. And at some point, I started to wonder, maybe the problem isn't that life keeps changing. Maybe the problem is thinking it's not supposed to. That question led me gently, like a hand on the back, into one of the Buddha's most powerful teachings, the 3 characteristics of existence. Not as dry doctrine or abstract philosophy, but as a tender, compassionate look at the nature of being alive. There's a candle on my desk right now, flickering as I speak to you. Its flame is soft, alive, always moving. You can't hold it in place without snuffing it out. And that's what life is like. Nothing stays the same. That's the first truth the Buddha pointed out. Anicca, impermanence. Everything, our thoughts, emotions, bodies, relationships, is in a constant state of change. Even the cells in our body are renewing. Even the mountain eventually becomes sand. But we forget this, don't we? We fall in love and wish it to stay exactly like day 3. We take a photo on a happy vacation and think, I want this moment to last forever. We get used to someone's presence and can't bear the thought of their absence. We write mental contracts with reality, demanding it hold still for us. And yet it never does. First, this realization can feel sad, even heavy. But what if it's not a curse, but a kind of mercy? If nothing stays the same, then no sorrow is permanent either. No grief is eternal. No mistake defines you forever. One evening, after a long day of holding things together, emotionally, professionally, all the things, I sat quietly at the edge of my bed. The light from the hallway spilled across the floor like water. I was tired, and something in me finally whispered, let it change. I didn't even know what it was, but I think my heart did. That small permission, that willingness to allow change, felt like an exhale I'd been holding for years. The second characteristic, dukkha, is often translated as suffering, but that word can be misleading. It's more than just pain. It's that underlying hum of dissatisfaction, the subtle tension of wanting things to be other than they are. Even in joy, we often feel this. Think of the last time you were happy, really happy. Wasn't there a part of you quietly afraid it might end? That's dukkha. It's in the tightness of holding on, in the hunger for more, in the fear of less. We don't suffer because things are impermanent. We suffer because we resist their impermanence. I remember watching an old couple at a train station once. They didn't talk much. They just sat beside each other, hands lightly touching. You could feel the years between them, not heavy, but soft, like a blanket that's been worn in just right. There was no clinging in their presence, just presence. And in that moment, I understood something about peace. It doesn't come from freezing time, it comes from flowing with it. The third characteristic, anatta, non-self, is perhaps the most mysterious of all. It's the teaching that there is no fixed, permanent I behind our experiences. No little controller sitting in the head pushing buttons. First, this sounded absurd to me. Of course I have a self. I mean, who's talking right now? But as I began to practice mindfulness, just watching thoughts come and go, feelings arise and pass, I noticed something surprising. The me I thought I was kept changing. One moment I was confident, the next insecure. One moment loving, the next irritated. Even my preferences shifted. Foods I once hated, I now craved. So who was the real me? And then I realized, maybe that question was like trying to find the flame in a single frame of a candle flickering. It's never exactly the same, even though it appears continuous. The Buddha wasn't saying we don't exist. He was saying we're not what we think we are. We're not the stories, the roles, the titles. We're not the anger we felt this morning or the sadness we'll feel tomorrow. We're a process, unfolding moment by moment, alive, changing, beautiful in our impermanence. There's an odd freedom in this. If we're not fixed, then we're not trapped. We don't have to keep being who we've been. We're free to grow, to let go, to love more deeply, to begin again. Sometimes I sit at a temple not far from my home. The garden there is quiet, with stone steps covered in moss, and wind chimes that make no sound unless you're listening. The monks sweep the leaves, even though more leaves will fall tomorrow. They sweep anyway. Watching them, I'm reminded that this practice isn't about escaping life, but touching it more gently, holding it like a bird in your hands, not too tight, not too loose, just enough to feel its heartbeat. When the Buddhist students glimpsed awakening, they didn't cry out in enlightenment. They whispered a simple truth. Whatever arises is bound to pass away. It wasn't a fact to memorize, it was a reality they felt, deep in their bones. The kind of knowing that changes how you see everything. And maybe that's what I hope this teaching becomes for you. Not a belief to accept, but a lens to look through. The next time something beautiful happens, smile and say, how precious. because it won't last. The next time something painful arises, breathe and say, "This too will pass." And in that space, in that gentle awareness, you may begin to taste something more lasting than pleasure or pain. You may begin to know peace, like the flame of a candle that flickers and dances, but never clings to the air, like the reflection of the moon on a quiet pond, untouched, ungraspable, and yet profoundly present. So if you ever find yourself overwhelmed, take a walk, sit under a tree, listen to the wind, and remember, change is not the enemy. It's the nature of life. And when you stop fighting it, you might find that life, just as it is, has been enough all along. Chapter 4. Walking the Path That Leads Home. I used to think that awakening was something sudden, like a flash of lightning across the sky, a grand, earth-shattering moment where everything clicks into place. And from then on, life is peaceful, effortless, and full of clarity. The way people describe it, enlightenment, made it sound almost like a prize you win, something distant and rare, reserved for sages meditating in remote mountain caves. But the more I explored the Buddha's teachings, the more I realized that awakening isn't some far-off destination. It's not a mystical experience reserved for the chosen few. It's a path, a simple, grounded human path, one that you and I are already walking, whether we realize it or not. Imagine a narrow trail winding through a quiet forest. Sunlight filters through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the earth. With each step, the crunch of leaves beneath your feet reminds you that you're moving forward, even if the way ahead isn't always clear. This is the path the Buddha left behind for us, the Noble Eightfold Path. He didn't just awaken and disappear into silence. He turned around and said, "Here, follow this way," not because it's the only path, but because it's one that leads not toward more confusion, but toward peace. Not toward more craving, but toward freedom. The first step is right view, seeing things as they really are. Not as we wish them to be, not as we fear they are, but simply as they are. This sounds simple, but have you ever noticed how much we resist reality? We get upset when people don't act the way we want. We cling to things, even when they're clearly slipping away. We tell ourselves stories about what should be, instead of looking at what is. There was a time in my life when I clung tightly to an idea of who I was supposed to be. I had this image, carefully crafted, unconsciously built, of what a good life looked like, what a successful person should achieve. And whenever life veered off script, whenever things didn't match the version I had in my head, I suffered. Right view isn't about being passive. It's about meeting life with open eyes, seeing that everything changes, that clinging leads to suffering, that nothing, no success, no failure, no fleeting moment of happiness can be held on to forever. And when we really see that, something softens. We stop fighting the tide, and we learn to flow. Then comes right intention, the choice to lean toward wisdom, kindness, and letting go instead of ignorance, grasping, and attachment. Our lives are shaped by what we intend, by the quiet decisions we make every day. I once met a man who had spent years chasing money and status, only to wake up one morning feeling utterly empty. "I don't know how I got here," he told me. "I just kept saying yes to the wrong things." That's how most of us live, on autopilot, swept up by habits we never consciously chose. Right intention is about asking, where am I pointing my life? Am I moving toward peace, or am I chasing things that only leave me more restless? Right speech is the next step, and this one is hard, because words have weight. They shape the world. A single sentence can lift someone up or crush them completely. And yet, how often do we speak without thinking? How often do we let anger, pride, or carelessness guide our words? I used to believe that honesty meant saying whatever was on my mind, no filter. But the Buddha taught that speech should be true, kind, and useful. If it's not all three, maybe silence is better. Right action follows, living in a way that causes no harm. It sounds simple, but in a world where it's easy to turn a blind eye, where harming others and ourselves is often normalized, it takes deep awareness. Right action isn't about following a list of rules. It's about walking gently, leaving as little suffering in your wake as possible. Then there's right livelihood, earning a living in a way that doesn't cause harm. In a world where success is often measured by profit alone, this teaching reminds us that how we make a living matters. If our work contributes to suffering, can we change it? If our job drains the life from us, can we shift towards something more meaningful? Right effort is about cultivating what is wholesome and letting go of what is not. It's the quiet discipline of choosing, again and again, what leads toward peace, even when it's hard. It's catching ourselves when we slip into old patterns. It's gently nudging our minds away from resentment, fear, and greed, and toward patience, love, and understanding. I used to think spiritual practice should feel effortless. But the truth is, anything worth growing takes effort. A garden doesn't bloom overnight. A peaceful mind doesn't appear just because we wish for it. Take steady daily care. Right? Mindfulness teaches us to be fully present, to actually live in the moment we're in, instead of constantly reliving the past or worrying about the future. If you've ever eaten a meal while scrolling through your phone, or found yourself nodding in conversation without really listening, you know how easy it is to drift through life half asleep. Right mindfulness is the gentle practice of waking up. And finally, right concentration, the deep focus that comes from a steady mind. A mind trained in meditation, in stillness, is like a quiet lake that reflects the sky clearly. Without it, our thoughts scatter in every direction, pulling us into stress, distraction, and craving. I used to struggle with meditation. I thought I was supposed to clear my mind, and every time a thought arose, I felt like I had failed. But the mind isn't supposed to be empty, it's supposed to be aware. Concentration isn't about getting rid of thoughts. It's about learning not to be dragged around by them. Each of these steps, each piece of the path, leads to the next. And the beauty is, you don't have to master them all at once. You don't have to walk perfectly. You just have to walk. And that's the part that took me the longest to understand. That awakening isn't about arriving. It's about walking. It's about choosing again and again to take one mindful step, then another. There's a story of a monk who was asked how he had attained enlightenment. He smiled and said, "I chop wood. I carry water." The same thing he had been doing before, but now with awareness, with peace. That's the heart of this path. We still wake up and go to work. We still have families, responsibilities, hard days, and good ones. But with every step, we can choose to meet life with wisdom instead of delusion, with patience instead of reactivity, with kindness instead of fear. And when we do that, not perfectly but sincerely, we begin to notice something. The suffering that once felt so heavy starts to lift. The restlessness begins to settle. The craving for something more starts to fade. And we realize, maybe for the first time, that everything we were looking for has been right here all along. Not in the next achievement, not in the next relationship, not in the next version of ourselves, but here, in this step, in this breath. One step at a time, we walk toward home. And home was never somewhere else. It was always right here. Chapter 5, the moment the Dhamma eye opens. I used to believe that real change, deep, lasting transformation came in dramatic waves. That one day, something big would happen, and suddenly, I'd be different, wiser, more peaceful, free. But life doesn't always unfold in grand gestures. Sometimes the most profound shifts happen quietly, like the way morning light enters a room. You don't notice it all at once, but suddenly, everything is bathed in gold. There's a story from the time of the Buddha about a man named Anathapindika. He wasn't a monk or a mystic. He was a layman, a wealthy merchant, known for his generosity. He supported the Sangha, fed those in need, and was deeply devoted to the Buddhist teachings. But despite all his goodness, all his faith, something still weighed on his heart. One day he came to visit the Buddha. Maybe he was seeking wisdom. Maybe he just wanted reassurance. We don't know exactly what was on his mind that day. But what we do know is that as he sat and listened to the Buddha speak, something shifted inside him. It wasn't just an intellectual understanding. It was something deeper, something that reached beyond words. The scriptures say, "The Dhamma I opened." This phrase, simple, poetic, carries a profound meaning. In that moment, Anathapindika saw, not with his physical eyes, but with a clarity that went beyond thought. He saw the truth of impermanence, the reality that everything he had ever clung to, his wealth, his family, even his own sense of self, was transient. And in that seeing, his suffering lifted. This kind of seeing is different from merely knowing something is true. Most of us already understand, in theory, that everything changes. We know that nothing lasts forever. But how often do we live as though we've truly grasped that truth? There's a difference between reading about the ocean and standing on the shore, feeling the waves crash against your feet. I remember the first time I caught a glimpse of impermanence in my own life, not as a concept, but as an undeniable reality. It was after losing someone I loved. The kind of loss that leaves you breathless, untethered, as if the ground beneath you has disappeared. I remember sitting alone in my apartment, staring at a cup of tea that had long gone cold. And in that silence, something settled inside me. I had spent so much time resisting, holding on, wishing things were different. But the more I fought against reality, the more I suffered. And then, in a moment of unexpected clarity, I whispered to myself, nothing stays, not the pain, not the love, not even me in the way I thought of myself. And instead of despair, there was relief. It wasn't that I wanted things to change. It was that I finally stopped pretending they wouldn't. This, I think, is what Anathapindika saw that day with the Buddha. And when the Buddha smiled at him and said, "Now you have truly seen," it wasn't a congratulation. It was a recognition, a moment of deep knowing, shared between two hearts. But here's the thing, awakening isn't an endpoint. It's not a moment where you suddenly become perfect, untouched by life. It's a door that opens, path that begins. Anathapindika didn't become a different person overnight. He still lived in the world. He still faced challenges, joys, losses. But from that day forward, he saw everything through a new lens. The same world, but no longer weighed down by illusion. The first glimpse of awakening is rarely loud. It's not about fireworks or divine voices from the sky. It's in the small shifts, the subtle changes in how we hold things. It's in the moment you stop resisting the truth and start moving with it instead. Maybe you've had moments like that, standing at a window, watching the rain, and realizing this, too, is passing. Holding the hand of someone you love, feeling their warmth and understanding. This moment will never come again, and that makes it precious. It's easy to think that awakening is something distant, something reserved for monks in faraway monasteries. But I don't think that's true. I think it happens in grocery store lines, in late-night conversations, in the quiet pause before we say something we'll regret. I think it happens every time we see clearly, every time we let go, even just a little. And maybe, just maybe, the Dhamma eye is waiting to open in all of us. We just have to stop closing it. Take a breath. Let it be. See what's here. And when you do, you might just find that everything you were looking for was already within you. Whenever you're ready, we can continue this journey together. The next step is waiting. I'll be here. Chapter 6. How can we awaken? I used to think awakening was something for other people. You know, the wise ones. The monks who lived in misty temples tucked into the mountains. Or the soft-spoken teachers who seemed to float through life, untouched by traffic, heartbreak, or deadlines. Me, I had laundry to do, rent to pay, an inbox that refused to shrink. There were days I couldn't even finish a cup of tea while it was still warm, let alone find time to meditate under a Bodhi tree. So the idea that awakening, true inner peace, was somehow available to someone like me felt out of reach. But here's the truth that began to unfold slowly, like the petals of a lotus opening in the morning sun. Awakening doesn't require a special robe or a secluded retreat. It begins right where we are, right now, in the mess, the noise, the ordinary rhythm of our daily lives. You don't have to renounce the world to touch something sacred. Sometimes, awakening arrives not through grand experiences, but through the quiet realization that you don't have to keep running. That you can simply sit down as you are and be here, fully, gently, awake. I remember one morning that changed something in me. Not in some epic lightning bolt way, but more like a subtle but irreversible shift. It was early, the sky still tinged with indigo. The house was silent. I had woken up too early before my alarm, which usually would have annoyed me. But that morning I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't rush to make coffee. I just sat on the edge of my bed and listened. There was a soft hum from the fridge, a bird calling somewhere in the distance, the faint rustle of wind in the trees outside. And then I heard something else, the gentle rhythm of my own breath. It was so simple, but in that moment, something opened. This, I realized, was enough. The Buddha taught that awakening isn't something we add to ourselves. It's what's revealed when we stop clinging, when we stop spinning stories, when we simply meet life as it is, with presence and compassion. And so, the question becomes, how do we begin? How do we awaken, not in some grand, final sense, but in this very moment? The first step is mindfulness, not the trendy, commodified kind that tells you to buy a candle and be zen. I'm talking about the real thing, the tender, often raw practice of actually being present with yourself, no matter what's arising. When you sit with a racing mind, with a restless body, with a heart that feels too full or completely numb, that's mindfulness. It's not about achieving calm. It's about being honest. There's something disarming, almost disorienting, about watching your thoughts with gentle curiosity. You begin to see how often you believe everything your mind says. That voice in your head that whispers, "You're not doing enough," or "You should be further along." You start to see that it's just a sound, just a pattern, just wind through the branches. And with practice, you stop reacting so automatically. You notice the space between stimulus and response. You realize you have a choice. In that space, awakening begins. The next step is reflecting on impermanence. This one takes courage, because the truth is, most of us don't want to see how quickly things change. We want permanence, security, guarantees. But life doesn't work that way. The cup will break. The flower will wilt. Even the people we love most will one day leave, or we will. And yet, instead of being morbid, this truth is oddly freeing. When we see that nothing lasts, we start to hold everything with more care. We become present to what's here, instead of chasing what's next. We learn to say, "Thank you" more often. We let go more easily. One of my teachers once said, "Every moment is like dew on a blade of grass, brief, fragile, beautiful." I didn't understand it then, but now, when I watch the way morning light dances on the kitchen floor or feel the last hug of a friend before they leave, I do. This moment, whatever it is precious precisely because it won't last. Then comes compassion. Real compassion isn't about being nice or saying the right words. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, that every person you meet is carrying something, that even the one who cuts you off in traffic or speaks harshly at work, they're probably suffering in ways you can't see. And that includes you too. Self-compassion is often the hardest part. We're taught to be kind to others, but no one teaches us how to be gentle with ourselves, how to forgive the mistakes, how to sit with our own sadness without rushing to fix it, how to say, "I'm doing the best I can," and mean it. When we drop the illusion of separation between me and you, right and wrong, success and failure, something softens. We begin to walk through the world with a little more tenderness. We stop bracing so much. We start to trust that kindness, not fear, is our truest compass. And finally, perhaps most quietly, we learn to embrace uncertainty. This may be the hardest and most beautiful part of awakening, letting go of the need to know what's coming. The mind wants answers, but the heart just wants peace. Life is uncertain, always has been, always will be, but that doesn't mean we're powerless. It means we're free. Free to stop gripping so tightly. Free to respond instead of react. Free to love without needing a guarantee. In the end, awakening isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who we already are beneath the fear, the noise, the striving. It's sitting down on your cushion or your kitchen floor, or the park bench where the breeze brushes your face, and whispering to yourself, "I'm here," and then doing it again tomorrow. The earth may not shake, but your life, quietly, deeply, begins to change. And so if you're wondering whether you're on the path, take heart. You're already walking. Every mindful breath, every act of kindness, every moment of letting go. These are steps, not towards some far-off mountaintop, but back to yourself, back to the home you never really left. Let's keep walking together. We often think awakening is something distant, reserved for monks or sages. But sometimes, it's simply the moment you realize there's nothing left to hold on to. When we stop clinging to impermanence, to emotions, to desires we thought were permanent, we see that letting go is not losing, but finally seeing clearly. Like a broken mirror, only when you stop trying to piece it back together do you realize you don't need it to see yourself. So, what is one thing you're holding onto today that's making you weary? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And if this journey resonates with you, subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings. Not just to watch more videos, but to plant seeds of wisdom together. See you in the next video where we continue learning how to see clearly without needing to control.